we can begin to ask, well, just does pain mean injury? And does pain mean tissue damage? So no. There's a guy named Perry Mickleston from his site is Stop Chasing Pain. He's a brilliant, brilliant teacher. But he has a great saying that pain is a request for change.
Hello and welcome to Health and Humanity with Dan Voss, a health podcast show centered around living healthier lifestyles and improving our human connection and relationships. I have with me today Dr. Kelly Starrett. Dr. Kelly Starrett is a coach, physical therapist, two-time New York Times and Wall Street Journal best-selling author, speaker, and co-founder of The Ready State, the world's most comprehensive collection of guided movement, mechanics, and mobility instructional videos. Kelly, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today.
Oh, super pleasure. And thank you for not killing everyone with a long bio. That was great.
Yeah, I got your two sets of bios from your team. I saw the long version and I figured I will save that for later.
Ain't nobody got time for that. Exactly.
Too many accolades. But you know what, man, that just goes to show, how much you've accomplished, and not to toot your horn too much here, but I mean, you've worked with professional athletes, Olympic athletes. You've been on all kinds of appearances, Joe Rogan Experience, Tim Ferriss Show, CBS Sports, 60 Minutes. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. And then I get a message back from your team saying, let's schedule this. And I'm just like, what? How cool. So this is an honor, really, to have you on.
Well, likewise, if you want to wind me up, let's talk about health and fitness and feeling better, we got thumbs. We can do this. We've got this.
Exactly, man. So let's get started with, I want to talk a little bit about the Ready State and how that kind of came to be. And most importantly, who is it for?
Well, it's actually ironic that you mentioned that. 10 years ago in September, we started making content as I called it, the Mobility Project, which was, I had this idea that, I was already working as a coach and teaching. I owned a gym. But people were still coming with the same sets of problems. And I was like, man, how come you don't know this? Your quads are stiff. That's why your leg is stuck at 90. You're just stiff. Why are you moving that way? That's totally grossly inefficient. And what I set out to do was make a video a day for a year. And when we started this thing, YouTube was barely a thing. The iPhone didn't have a video camera on it. There's no Twitter. There's no Insta for sure. No Google Analytics. And, we set out to solve a problem, and I set it out to solve a problem for myself so that I could be go watch video 44 and 47, right?
Yep.
Around sleep or some kind of mechanic. And I needed a sort of a reference for my own community, and the thing just steamrolled. And it was no one had ever said to our greater public, you can take a crack at solving your own pain. You can improve how you move and feel. And those aren't medical problems. That's the domain of training. And, fast forward, 10 years of making content and helping people solve the problems of their day, and you get pretty good. You start to see more patterns. And one of the fun things about the Ready State is it's born out of our clinical experience working with the All Blacks or the U.S. Army or the Navy or, the Astros, or choose a team, choose an organization, choose a sport, or Google or Amazon or Microsoft. People really struggling with, how do I have a healthier workforce with less absenteeism, presenteeism? Those are actually just gradations of the same conversation. How do I PR in my triathlon is the same conversation of, how does my back not hurt when I'm sitting in the chair? And, what's been really fun is that as we have become more sophisticated as consumers in the last 10 years, some of us who have access to this information, it's really the promise for the first time where I think, people, we are realizing that pain is not a medical problem, and that injury means you can't do your job or occupy a role in society, or there's a bone sticking out of your leg and you have rabies. It's clear something's going on. But the rest of it maybe is in the domain of nutrition and sleep and stress, and feeling like I'm connected to a tribe of people. And what's interesting is it seems like there's this huge, disparate, unconnected set of tasks and skills that I have to remedy to be functional or to feel better. but all of those things came out of sport. And I think one of the problems of being a human being today is that our genetics and our tolerance of our bodies is so extraordinary. You can drink a bottle of wine a night to take the edge off of your stressful job and the fact that you have 2 kids and a big mortgage. And you can do that for a long time until one day you can't.
Yep.
So one day your tissues start to hurt, or you go to run and you have inflamed tissues, or you're pre-diabetic, or the sleep quality is terrible and your hair falls out, or like choose something that you care about. And all of that came out of the fact that many of us did not have a connection tool to necessarily relate our daily behaviors with, sort of inputs and outputs. And part of that is that because we haven't really appreciated that we're running this experiment for 50, 60, 70 years. And that sometimes the behaviors we engage in today, it's difficult to see the impacts when I'm 50 or 60 and I've lost bone density, or I can't get up off the ground without using my hands, or I ride my bike and my back hurts. So sport really gave us an opportunity to sort of stress test the physiology and practices of humans, and what are best practices around nutrition and fueling and sleep and downregulation and stress and belonging and movement. And then now here we are suddenly, and we can say, hey, we have ways of helping people manage that and navigate their lives. And that's what we're trying to do with the Ready State.
I love that. And the reason why I'm so excited and I have a smile on my face right now is because what I'm doing with my podcast is quite different than what you're doing with the Ready State, but it's also very similar in the sense that it's about nutrition and sleep and physical activity and just living a better, cleaner, healthier life overall. And the reason why I'm most excited right now is obviously given the world we're living in. I think now health is more important than it's ever been. Obviously, it's always been important, but maybe that's not the best way to phrase it. I don't know if it's the most. It's never been a better time to focus on it. I do think it's the most aware we've been.
And I'll add, I agree. I think we're sort of woke, health woke. We have the most forces sort of conspiring against us. LED lights, the ability to stay up and watch Netflix. You don't have to walk very far. There's just a whole lot of things now.
Yep.
The computer, right, that makes it much more difficult to really, fall into those basic principles that create human health: sleep, belonging, safety, nutrition, right, stress. And what we see is, let's just do it. Let's play the game. So if you're listening to this, how are we doing? Do we have less back pain, less absenteeism? Are we skinnier? Are we less diabetic? Let's choose something, and you're going to see we've actually fallen on our face and we haven't done anything. I'm going to give us all a D+, because at least some of us are trying, but we have not served the people. We're not doing a good job of constraining our environments so that we don't have to make another choice. And I think the problem right now is it has been about social justice and access to health and access to wellness, but if you're worried about, food insecurity, or, you have racial stress, we can't really have the next conversation yet, right? We can't talk about your food choices. And ultimately we're going to have to realize that we may have lost a generation of people in this experiment, and that we're going to have to start earlier and say, well, maybe we can start with the next generation in the elementary schools about saying, of course I walk 10,000 steps a day, and of course I sleep 8 hours a night, and of course I, know how to breathe when I feel stressed. But in the meantime, I don't think we're doing a very good job.
Yeah, I so agree. I completely agree that we have a lot of things stacked up against us. I just had an interview on my podcast a couple weeks ago with a gentleman by the name of Ian Hart, and he told me, this is the first I heard of it, that when you have Wi-Fi running through your house, the frequencies affect your sleep. And that was the first time I ever heard that. He went into much greater detail. He knows much more about it than I do. That's just one example of something that's kind of getting in our way of health and wellness.
And I think it's easy to suddenly be overwhelmed by the number of choices that are theoretically, is this the 5G? Is that what's brought on the COVID?
Yeah.
And, in Germany, you can turn off the electro smoke, on your shut down the Wi-Fi. But is that the greatest limiting factor right now? And what's interesting is that, I never set out to want to lecture people about sleep or downregulation or stress. I'm interested in hot, dirty, nasty performance. I want you to run faster, lift bigger weights, do it till you're 110. I help the world's best athletes get better and play longer. I mean, that is my my secret weapon. I had to get interested in public health and these issues because we couldn't excuse them. So now if people have chronic pain and persistent pain, which is a huge issue, people are living with a lot of dysfunction, a lot of pain. It really ruins their lives. And especially right now where you can't see your physician, you can't see your chiro, you can't see your PT. And, one of the things I say to them is like, well, show me your sleep. And they're like, I said, great. I'm like, I don't believe you. I don't believe you anymore. I'm like, you need to get a sleep tracker. And I need to see how long you're in bed and actually what's going on. And where we can begin to, put the pieces in place where we can say, hey, I don't take it for granted anymore that you're actually drinking water. I don't take it for granted anymore that you ate a fruit and a vegetable. This Game Changer documentary came out and everyone's like, I'm going vegan. I'm like, great. Can I see how many vegetables you ate this week? Oh, you didn't eat any. You ate crackers and beef jerky and, and some charcuterie. Like you're going to go 100% vegan, but you actually didn't eat any vegetables or fruits. So, when we begin to ask people just to be aware of some of these processes, then I think we'll be able to get into the next piece. And unfortunately, I can't talk about your tendinopathy or your crappy stiff tissues or your inability to adapt to the training stimulus unless we also talk about these things.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. What about somebody that comes to you with, obviously it depends on their case, but a specific type of pain? Like for myself, I've always had lower back pain. What can I be doing better? I mean, obviously that's a very general question, but is it just looking at things like my sleep, my nutrition, my exercise?
Well, I think the way to think about that is to appreciate a couple things. And, I'm a physical therapist and I'm a strength and conditioning coach. And my wife will say, I don't even know if you're that good a physical therapist, but you give people permission and reassure them that it's going to be okay and that they can move again, right? Which is part of the game. So let's start with a couple ideas. One is if you put an orca into captivity, and this analogy comes from our friend Katie Bowman, who is wonderful and brilliant. But if you put an orca in captivity, eventually the fin folds over. And what we know is that if you want to have a strong fin in an orca, that fin has to be loaded, which means you need to swim, hunt, fight, play, do orca stuff. And if you don't do that, the collagen becomes weaker. And if you change the behavior of the orca so it's suddenly doing something all the time that would do some of the time, and you expose that fin to higher gravitational load, moment arm, so it's likely to fall over a little bit more. Well, that orca fin, folded fin, is an analogy for your tendons and ligaments and your cartilage and your discs. You have to load them. And the key concept here is a principle called mechanotransduction, which means if you want your Achilles to act like an Achilles, you better mechanically load it. I'm not talking about nutrition. I'm talking about mechanical input. Do you remember in the 90s, there was like this crazy, crazy fad about osteoporosis? Do you remember this?
I do, yeah.
Every woman has osteoporosis, and there was 1,000 like caramel like calcium chews. Remember that?
Yeah, I must admit to you, I was born in '91, but I'm still old enough to know and hear the term.
It's basically the same thing, right? Yeah. 1973, 1991. Yep. And one of the things we know is that women started upping their calcium, which is crazy that we had to tell women to eat calcium. Like, that's crazy, because if you cook your meat on the bones, if you eat vegetables, there's a lot of calcium to be had in the world, right? Like broccoli has more calcium than, milk, as they say, right? Yep. But if you don't eat vegetables and fruits, if you don't cook your meat on the bone, if you don't eat bone broth, you don't do the things that humans have been doing in all cultures for as long as we've been humans, suddenly you need some calcium. So you supplement, no problem. But it turns out we weren't loading. So we're like, oh, you took all this calcium and nothing changed. Why? Because You didn't actually stress your bones, which is Wolff's law of use it or lose it. Who's like in the 1800s was like, oh, this German Julius Wolff was like, turns out bones respond to mechanical stress. So we start with that idea that you better keep loading and we better keep moving. So now I can say, okay, well, we've got that idea that in order for you to express a healthy back, you need to load and move. Okay. So that changes your thing. It's not rest. It's not a fear avoidance, but that's something you're like, oh, well, I didn't realize that. Yep. And then secondarily, we can begin to ask, well, just does pain mean injury? And does pain mean tissue damage? So no. There's a guy named Perry Mickelston from his site is Stop Chasing Pain. He's a brilliant, brilliant teacher. But he has a great saying that pain is a request for change. So we have always treated pain, and I'll tell you, pain is highly subjective, and it's not a medical problem. One of my best friends is this woman named Rebecca Rush, who is a 7-time world champion mountain biker. I happen to know the other reigning world champion mountain biker right now in cross country. And if they were in the middle of a race and you poured it into their bodies, you would die. You couldn't handle the pain and immense suffering going on that they think is like, oh yeah, it's Tuesday. No big deal.
Yeah.
So what we want to appreciate is that we're getting these signals to change a behavior. And that might be a movement behavior, sleep behavior, right? My beliefs around my pain. And the next thing we'll do is we'll take a look at your breathing and we'll take a look at your non-exercise activity. So the first 2 prescriptions for anyone who has any low back pain for me, first and foremost is, okay, you have to sleep between 8 and 9.5 hours a night. So to get 8 hours of sleep, you may need for 9 hours. So if you get into bed at 11 and you get up at 7, I guarantee you did not sleep 8 hours, right?
Yep.
That you slept sub 8 hours. And anything that is sub 8 hours, if you're dealing with pain, is another threat signal to your brain. So I can't even tell what's going on. Like there's so much noise.
Sure.
Secondarily, I'm going to say, hey, I need you to walk. And you win 10 to 15,000 steps a day. And you're like, but I get back pain after 5 minutes of walking. I'm like, great. Then you're going to walk for 5 minutes and you're going to lay down. And then you're going to walk for 1 minute and then lay down. And then you're going to walk for 1 more minute until you get 10,000 steps.
Yep.
And until we signal the body. And some of this is the simple idea of decongestion. This is how we move lymph and waste through the body. Yep. Do you think that dragon breath that we did in yoga, like, forget it about your brain. That's just about circulating fluids in your trunk, right? And if I have an unhealthy or a painful tissue, one of the first things I can do is get out the junk, take out the garbage, bring in the groceries, get non-sensitizing, non-threatening movement in. When you take a breath in, you extend. When you breathe out, you flex. Boy, it seems like I could do a lot of that during the day and start to send that signal back up. Then we can look at your behavior. Well, I'm not sure human beings were designed not to move for huge chunks of the day. In fact, it's not sitting is bad, standing is good. It's moving is better. Are you constantly moving? When you're tired, sit down. When you're less tired, stand back up and keep moving again. As I'm talking to you, I'm actually doing a rare interview where I'm sitting, but I'm sitting on a bench cross-legged. I'm de facto on the floor. So notice that it's not a weakness problem. It's not a motor control problem. It's not necessarily a skill-based problem. The first thing we've done is said, hey, what are the conditions where we can help you to desensitize and upregulate your physiology function? And then we can talk about your stiff-ass hips and the fact that your T-spine is a board and the fact that your tail is wagging your dog. I mean, how about this? Your legs are directly connected to your spine, not via your hips, via a muscle called your psoas.
Okay.
And if you sit all the time, imagine if I just kept my arms bent at 90 degrees all the time. At the end, and if you have a baby, you know what I'm talking about, because at the end of the day, you put the baby down, you're like, oh, I can't straighten my arms out. That is your hip flexors and your psoas. So your leg is directly attached to your spine. And when you suddenly stand up, there's a lot of forces on your spine. Now, those forces aren't causing your pain, but they may have sensitized you. So changing the mechanics, restoring your ability to move like everyone on the planet should be able to move. This is not like I need gymnast level range of motion. This is, why can't you do what every physician, every physical therapist, every chiro has to learn on the planet? This is how much range of motion is normative for the human being.
Yep.
So when we start to do that, and then we look at all the tools we have to desensitize or self-treat, I'm like, why do we have back pain? Good question.
Yeah.
You must have gotten hit by a bus.
Is that a rhetorical question or is that a legit question?
No, I mean, it's a rhetorical question.
Yeah.
And I'll say that I'm the kid who was hospitalized at age like 10 with chronic low back pain because I was super overextended.
Yep.
Went to the doctor because my back hurt and they were saying it's growing pains. I was like, I don't think so now. I ended my kayaking career because I had a neck injury because my shoulders and breathing were terrible. And so I get back pain. I understand. I am the poster child for I'm never doing this again. Right.
Yep.
That's what I'll say.
Yeah, no, so just some history for myself. I have 2 herniated discs and I've seen physical therapists and it's better, but it's not 100% better.
So let's talk about this for a second. This is so great because when did you realize that you had herniated the disc in your back?
This was 2015.
Okay.
So 5 years ago.
So check this out. Your discs are no longer herniated.
Interesting.
How about this? You have a story now that you told yourself about your back that you've come to believe.
Yeah.
Let's do a thought experiment because this is really important and the heart of what it is that sometimes keeps us back from moving forward.
Yep.
If we all herniated discs so easily and we didn't heal, and if the nervous system couldn't manage that, do you think there would be human beings around right now? No. So the herniated disc is like a torn meniscus, right? It's a problem. And when it's irritated, your life was ruled by that thing. I am giving full homage to the fact that you have some very intense structures, i.e. your nervous system running right next to those discs.
Yep.
The interesting question is, were there behaviors, were there things we could have done to avoid the challenging of those tissues to a place where they expressed a tissue failure? That's a really interesting conversation, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes it's an accident and we can't manage it, but sometimes we know that some people are more predisposed for genetically for disc injuries. So What does that mean? That means that they're less flexion intolerant. We have to make sure that we're loading the spine daily. We have to be eating collagen and doing all the other things. We have to turn up the dials on some of those things. But discs heal. And one of the things that's really interesting now is that your brain, because it is the most complex, sophisticated structure in the universe, is super clever. And it says, I remember what that thing was in the back, and I'm not doing that again. And anytime you move or do something where you start to get into the same shape as when you had that, or the same mental pattern or stress pattern or behavior pattern, and those are the same, your brain says, I know what I'm going to warn you from that, and I'm going to start sending out the messages. So, what's really interesting is that we have to do a lot of programming because the language that physicians and physical therapists have used was catastrophizing. We have led people to believe that they are not anti-fragile, that they stop healing, that you have a glass back. Like, are you serious? Let me tell you a story about one of my friends, Donnie Thompson. This is so good. This friend, Donnie Thompson, who was doing some lifting from a bad position, he knew, and he herniated a couple of discs.
Yep.
And he had drop foot syndrome, so he had real neurologic deficits. This is like MRI, definitely discs herniated, and was pushing on some of the nerves in his back, and it made his muscles in his shin not work. Okay. He also played professional football.
Yep.
Okay. 18 months later, he set the world record in powerlifting.
Wow.
And he squatted 1,300 pounds tried to squat 1,400 pounds. He deadlifted 800 pounds, right? He benched like 800 pounds.
Yeah.
And what's interesting about that is he did that without any pain. And I agree that the recipes vary differently on us, but we really haven't been very honest with people about how to make themselves feel better, how to get involved, and how to manage these things. And then also how not to catastrophize, because I believe you that those things ruled your life and that was a pain.
Yeah. Definitely. You've touched on so many great things I want to kind of go further on here. Number one, sleep. You're right. I think I get 8 hours, 8 to 8.5, but I'm really probably getting like 7 good hours. So that's
which I want everyone to understand. Per our friend Kirk Parsley, Doc Parsley, who was a Navy SEAL doc, is the threshold for threat as a human being. So 7 hours and less is I'm barely holding on, not 6, 7.5. And last year we averaged as a country 6.2.
That's so bad. That's so scary.
You're like, I got 7 hours of sleep. I'm special. People love to point out, they're like, Bill Clinton only slept 4 hours.
Right.
I was like, Bill Clinton died.
Yeah, right? He died inside, right?
No, I mean, he had a heart attack. He died. And then he would have died. And then we brought him back.
Yeah.
Right? So.
Oh, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
I'm like, it's pretty clear what the problem is. And
I forgot about that.
That's right. You
don't hear much about that, do you?
No. So, but my point is, when we start saying, well, what can I control? Because that's really this conversation here, right? Because like right now, parents are adults. I mean, if you're lucky enough to have a job, you can work at home, that's amazing. But people are super stressed. And what we want to do is help not add things to the list. If I have to tell my wife, like, she's got to take this turmeric and do this secret squirrel program and do these things and sit in front of this red light, she's like, I'm not going to do another thing to my list. You're crazy. And so what I want to do is help people begin to see their 24-hour cycle as a game that you can't win. So stop that. Like, you know how you win life? You die. So you lose. You know how you win business? You don't win business, right? How do you win your relationship with your significant other? Nah, you don't ever win. All you keep doing is playing better and better. And what we've done is we've taken some of these issues that are definitively infinite games, games that shouldn't be played like a finite game, and we have gamified our lives in a way that we think I'm a winner or a loser. And that is such short-sightedness. And when we begin to construct a 24-hour cycle in the context of what can I control, when do I do it? My doctoral work was looking at barriers to adherence. So what keeps people from doing what they say they're going to do? And we start to constrain the environment. So, man, if you don't want to sit down, don't have a chair. You know what I mean? If you don't want to eat little chocolate donuts, don't have little chocolate donuts in your house. I mean, it really is. When you start to think of it this way, and when you suddenly realize you get to the end of the day, you'll get a chance to play again tomorrow, and you can play better. So one bad night's sleep because you have a newborn or you're super stressed, don't worry about it. But that can't be the normal. And what you're going to do is say, hey, how do I set up my life so I can play a better game tomorrow? And sleep is just one of those pieces.
It's really unbelievable how much control we actually have over the outcomes of our lives, to the point that you really can decide, okay, I'm not going to eat those chocolate donuts, I'm not going to have that extra beer, or I'm going to stand instead of sit. Like, we have so much control. It's just actually having the discipline to do it.
Well, that's such a good trigger, because our friend Jocko Willink says, discipline is freedom, but discipline is habit. And one of the things that I want to appreciate, I have everyone appreciate, is that the serotonin boost from your phone, highly addictive. I have 2 children who we fight the addiction to their cell phones every day. They have to turn them in the evening. We fight them all day long because they're such addictive things. Your television, sugar, I mean, keep choosing, weed, caffeine, like, we are all about self-soothing. So one of the things that we do, for example, is any time where I can create a situation where you don't have to make a decision, then for me, that's a win. One of our friends, E.C. Sinkowski, has this thing called the 800-gram challenge. And her idea is, hey, I want you to eat 800 grams of vegetables and fruits in a day. And if you're like, dude, I'm not eating 800 grams of broccoli, I'm like, don't do it. Eat 800 grams of apples. It's so nutrient dense. You're going to be stuffed. You're like, I can't eat. And then show me you're going to binge on a bag of, Twinkies. You're not going to do it because you are stuffed from eating. So what ends up happening is that we can, instead of taking things away and having this austerity, exercise as punishment, I'm like, dude, chug 2 liters. If you're really worried about pigging out, chug a liter of water and let me know how full you are. You know what I mean? Like, we can do that. Like, have a big glass of water before you feel like you're going to reach for a beer. And what you'll see is that, you can start to make choices around that
Mm.
where, if you set an alarm an hour before you want to go to bed, that's the time to start thinking about your sleep.
Mm.
And if you should give up the caffeine between 12 and 4, I guarantee you'll actually be more sleepy. If you walk your 10,000 steps,
Yep.
by the time you hit the pillow, you're actually going to be tired enough to fall asleep.
Mm.
So we have to be thinking that these behaviors aren't discrete and unrelated to the rest of us. They're all continuum and tightly coupled.
For sure. I'm really happy you're talking about walking, because I've been doing my fair share of walking, especially during quarantine.
Yes.
There's not much else to do. I mean, you can do workouts kind of, at home or out at park, but walking, I think, in my opinion, is the most underrated form of exercise, something that we don't do.
I'll say it's non-exercise. It's like brushing your teeth.
True.
It's like it's moving the shit around. And what's interesting is if you walk briskly, your butt will turn on. If you walk briskly, all the nootropic growth factors in your brain start to turn up, because your brain is like, what's going on? You're walking fast in the environment. I better pay attention. And it turns out that one of the things that drives sleep latency, how fast I fall asleep, is fatigue and accumulated fatigue during the day. And some of that is how much ATP you burned. I mean, that is the new research. Like the adenosine off that ATP, adenosine triphosphate, the more adenosine you have floating around, your brain is going to clear that out at night. But it's that thing that drives sleep pressure. But sometimes we fail to appreciate that if you are super stressed and don't feel like you have time to walk, then you don't move your body, and then you don't fall asleep, or because you're not actually fatigued. So at some level, I want us to think that we are these human animals, need certain care and feeding, and they're non-negotiable. It's just non-negotiable.
I want to touch on that idea of, especially you being, a guy you're a trainer, you're a coach, you're in the gym. That's been a big part of your career. But because you are training people for a specific goal, right? You're training Olympic athletes, professional athletes, they have intended outcomes. But somebody like myself who, I'm not an Olympic athlete, I've run a couple marathons, and during those times I've trained for a marathon, but outside of that, and maybe sports growing up, I played football through high school and ran track, but outside of those times, I'm just an average guy that wants to stay fit and stay, in good shape. What are your thoughts on just getting movement throughout the day? And then if you can get a gym, like a soul crushing workout in, that's just like icing on the cake.
Well, I think you hit it right. I think we look at exercise or an exercise class or breathing hard as enough, right? So Harvard defines sedentary behavior as sitting more than 6 hours a day.
Okay.
So doesn't matter if you exercise out of that, you now have a sedentary behavior. And that 6 hours is total cumulative hours, time at the table, time in the car. And it's easy to be like, whoa, I'm really battling myself. So first and foremost, I think a decade ago, I'd have been like, you should deadlift 2 times your body weight, be able to do 10 pull-ups and run a mile in 10 minutes. And now I'm like, did you walk? Tell me about your sleep. Do you feel loved and safe in your house? I mean, those are as important. But what I want people to appreciate is I still coach, or I did before our gyms were closed, a general fitness class I called skilled conditioning, which is imagine what a modern movement practice looks like, which is, hey, we recognize that you need to be under some load, that VO2 max is a big predictor of mortality and morbidity, and that someone needs to help you keep an eye on your range of motion and your skilled range of motion. So can you put your arms over your head? Well, you don't have to worry about that because we're going to do pull-ups every day. So at some point, I really became agnostic about the way you want to train. So if you're like, Kelly, I do Pilates and I ride a Peloton and I go to church, I'm like, wow, you're pretty great. Swing a kettlebell and you're in there, right? Like, we need a little bit more loading than we get in the Pilates. If you're like, I go, I swing kettlebells and I run hills and I do some yoga, I'm like, oh, you're in there, right? So what we realized is the overlap between these functional traditions, martial arts, dance, yoga, Pilates, functional training, which looks like kettlebells and barbells and rings and muscle, kind of calisthenics and weight training. All of those things are ultimately have come to us as expressions of what the human should do. So for example, we think of the shoulder as this very complex structure, and it's not that complex. And really, the shoulder only has a few true bookends of position. Putting your arm over your head, internally rotating your hand like you're grabbing something off the sign or doing a robot dance, getting your shoulder behind you like you're doing the bottom of a push-up, right? And then holding something in front of you like a laundry basket or pressing something over your head. Those are really the ends of the range of motion of the shoulder. And what you'll see is that if you jump into a yoga class and you have those positions in your mind that I just described, you're going to be shocked at how much time you spend in each one of those positions. Doing a reverse tabletop or triangle pose or down dog. And suddenly you're like, oh, I see. Someone 2,000 years ago figured out humans should practice these shapes, and we should spend a little time making sure we have tolerance in these shapes. Yeah. And if you jump into Pilates or any modern strength and conditioning practice, you'll see that basically every movement we do conforms in some iterative position. It may not be directly overhead. It might be slightly over as I throw something, but it turns out it's the same position. So what we can then begin to say is, well, do you have a complete movement practice? So, when I was lecturing at Stanford Medical School, I asked all the young physicians, raise your hand if you have a movement practice, and all the hands shoot up. And I'm like, oh, really? Tell me about it. And they're like, I swim. I'm like, exercise, that's a sport. And someone's like, biking. And I'm like, great, exercise, that's a sport, not a movement practice. And then this girl sheepishly goes, yoga? And I was like, nailed it. You nailed it. Right? That's a movement practice. And then we can really have a spirited debate about what is the most effective way to train, or what is the things you like to do, or what's the minimum therapeutic dose. What we told people is if you did bicep curl and you crush yourself in the elliptical machine, you were fit. And guess what? That's a lie, because you didn't make the body do what the body's supposed to do. And I'm not talking about physiology. I'm talking about range of motion, exposure to your full sort of embodiment of your positions. Here's an example. You should be able to cross your legs and sit on the ground and then stand back up without having to put your hand down or knee down, right?
Interesting.
And you're like, whoa, I don't know. It seems pretty sketchy. Getting up and down off the ground, it's pretty hairball. Well, the number one reason people end up in nursing homes is they can't get up and down off the ground independently. The best predictor of mortality is that if you fall when you're 70 and fracture a hip, you're likely to die because you'll get pneumonia in the hospital and be considerably trained. And what that test is a test of simple balance. It's not ankle range of motion. It's barely hip range of motion. But what we see is that we haven't done a good job of creating movement vital signs for people. How do you know you have a movement problem? Well, something hurts, or you have a tissue failure where you've herniated a disc or torn something. And then we're like, oh, this must just be a medical problem, and we'll wait till it heals, and then good luck. And meanwhile, we've stripped all of the skill out of being a human being. And sleeping is a skill, and learning how to eat foods is a skill, and cook is a skill, and learning how to move well is a skill. But we're afraid to make this a skill-based activity for some reason, and we shouldn't be. It's okay, because we are the hallmark of human beings is we are learning machines, which means we can figure this out. And it's a lot less complicated than you think.
Absolutely. What about the idea of flexibility? Like for myself, I'm embarrassed to admit this, but I can barely touch my toes without bending my knees. Is that a big problem?
No.
It's okay?
I don't know. You tell me. You have herniated discs in your back. So the question is, if your hips are missing the ability to move the way we'll call full normal, right? Which is, so bending over and touching your toes is actually hip flexion, except instead of bringing your knee to your chest, you're bringing your chest to your knees. And you're doing so instead of a short lever or bent knee position, it's in what I call a long lever position. And what I'll tell you is that normal spines flex, normal spines extend. If you don't flex and extend your spine, it's not normal. But if your posterior chain, if your hamstrings and glutes and calves and tissue and fascia is restricted for whatever reason, and you start to bend over and you run out of room, your back is going to solve that problem for you. And your lumbar spine is going to become 5 more hip joints. And so if I want to improve your output, improve your function, give you more movement choice, then it seems to me that improving your ability to flex your hip is one of the ways that I can give you more movement choice, right?
Okay.
That means you have more movement options. And
Right.
flexibility is a really interesting thing because flexibility generally describes the properties of a rubber hose. Your body shouldn't be flexible. Your body is a dynamic spring system. If we look at the human Achilles tendon, for example, when it's stretched, it returns 80% of its energy into your forward locomotion and running. I don't want to stretch that out. If you stretch a rubber band out, it becomes a useless rubber band, right? So I don't want you to be, I want you to be springier. But what I'll also say around behaviors, and this is really interesting because I'm like, should you stretch? Everyone's like, of course you should stretch. I'm like, well, do you stretch? And they're like, no. And the reason is humans are really clever. We'll always do things and repeat behaviors that make us better and make us feel better and improve something we care about, right? So you give up eating bagels and you stop binging on cookies and suddenly you get a six-pack. You're like, ooh. Like you get all this positive affirmation for your six-pack because you give up these carbs. Well, I guarantee you, you'll make a mental note of that. Like, you want a bagel? Nah, I'm good. I like these abs instead, right? If I gave you stretching and it didn't decrease your pain, it didn't improve your range of motion, it didn't change your power out per wattage, and you didn't crush someone on the bike or the Peloton or something, guess what? You're like, this is a useless behavior, right? Why would I do that? You know, like chew my food 100 times. I used to like, well, I don't think I need to chew my food 100 times. Probably 20 times or 10 times is enough. So what ends up happening, we found, is that people don't do what doesn't work. And the reason we chose the word mobility, and if you've heard the word mobility, you're welcome. That's us who's popularized this word. It's because what we found was that we needed what we call position transfer exercises. We needed to help people move more effectively at their available ranges and stop compensating, stop walking around the problem to solve it, right? Just like you're going to touch your toes. If I say touch your toes, you're going to touch your toes. You'll flex all your extra hip joints. You'll go to your end range. You'll bend you'll get it done. But then nowhere in there, you're like, hey, I'm missing hip flexion. I should probably work on that. Well, what do I do? I don't even know. So, I mean, do I just touch my toes more? I mean, so what we try to do then is say, hey, look, here's a set of behaviors that can help you restore your normalcy as a human. Here's what we all agree. You know, for example, full range of motion is I should be able to sit out with my legs out in front of me with my back straight. And I should be comfortable there. I should be able to take a full breath. But most of us are going to dump and sit back and can't breathe and can't touch my toes. I don't care if you can touch your toes. I just want you to have choice and movement option, right? So that is the heart of it, is how do we give people things that work? Well, we're clever and we're modern and we have access to all the tools. We have access to all the masters. You have access to gua sha and cupping and percussion and mobilization and rollers and time. You can do this. You got this. And what I'm asking you to do is to expand your skill set as a human being a little bit more. And you don't have to, give up your job and become a monk to figure this out. It's a lot easier than that.
We have so much access. I mean, I know there's so much craziness going on in the world right now. And most people will say 2020 is the worst year ever. But I still believe that right now is the best time to live. I mean, the access that we have to information and resources is just unbelievable.
Well, I tell you, I think this is foreshadowing. I think that we'll see this again in our lifetimes. So what are we going to learn from this? I think it's an old Nelson Mandela quote. It says, we win or we learn. And I think it's notable. And one of my friends says it is a coach. And I'm like, well, who's winning right now? No one. So what are we learning right now? And when climate change hits us, and you can't live in Miami because it's underwater, and Texas 140 degrees, and we start to see mass migration, we're going to have to confront some of these issues again. And one of I think the salient opportunities right now is to say, well, I know how to exercise my kids, right? Because I can swing a kettlebell, do basic calisthenics, I can walk, I can control my sleep. If I don't have access to my nutritionist, I know how to eat. If I don't have a physical therapist, I know how to help manage pain in my household, right? that's where we have failed about making people truly independent, right?
Yeah.
We've sort of outsourced it.
Super fascinating stuff, man. I want to be respectful of your time, so I just have a few more questions for you.
Hit me.
This next one is more of a fun question. If you were stuck on an island,
this isn't fun. Like we've been talking about, like
I'm sorry. This has been this has been fun, but this is the
gnarliest conversation we've ever had.
This is a little bit less serious of a question. So, well, I guess it could be serious because if you're stuck on an island for 1 month and you have no kettlebells, no weights, no resistance bands, but you can choose one exercise to do throughout that month, what would that one exercise be? Or movement?
Eating ice cream.
Eating ice cream.
And if it's not eating ice cream, it is sleeping. And if it's not sleeping, I would tell you it's breathing. I fell into love with a breath practice, what I call a mechanical breathing practice, as my source of meditation, from my friend Laird Hamilton, who organized and kind of came through these things through Wim Hof.
Yes.
And if there's one thing I think you could benefit from that would change your readiness, change your ability to downregulate, circulate lymph in your body, improve your VO2 max, I would say stay on the breathing.
Yes.
And there's enough really good, simple information there. And in 10 minutes a day, I've already done my hot monkey breath like 20 times in the truck. I'm sitting in traffic and I'm like, well, I might as well, work on this while I'm sitting in the car. I don't have anything else to do.
Yep.
And I would say it would be that.
That's awesome, man.
You were hoping I would say burpee, but it was not burpee.
I was thinking burpee. I know everyone says burpee, but I like that answer much better. And I know you're a very busy guy, but if I can have you back on the show later on in a year, 5 years, whatever it is, I want to have an episode just talking about breathing and the Wim Hof method, because I've been giving that a try really for the last 6 months, and I love it. I'm just so jacked up about it.
I think what's important is that Wim put it back on our radar and demystified it. I think the yogis have been on it. I think people have been on it for a million years, but it was all wrapped in mysticism and it was about downregulation. And what we didn't realize is that we had this untapped reservoir of capacity. Yep. And I think what we're seeing right now is people, as an example, people have strong reactions to wearing masks. And some of that, I think, is they feel really uncomfortable wearing masks because they're CO2 intolerant, right? They're poor breathers, they're mouth breathers. Politics aside, this is something, when people go to the hospital, we have to give them these forced respirometers. Yeah. Like we have to encourage them to breathe. Why am I teaching someone to breathe? What is this about? What are we talking about? Why don't you know this already? And so I would love to talk about it and talk about how we use it to help our Tour de France cyclists get into better positions on the bike, and how we help young kids, calm down, and how we help our Olympic lifters clean and jerk national records because they can pressurize more effectively. It's the same.
That is so cool. Well, I'm excited. We're going to have that conversation sometime down the road because I think we share a mutual interest there.
Oh, it's so interesting.
Yeah, very cool, man. Before I let you go, where can we send people? You got your website, The Ready State. Anywhere else you'd like to have people find you? I guess they can probably Google you and find you all over.
Yeah, unfortunately, you'll hear my voice eventually. What I would say is, if you're interested in what we're talking about, and you're like, hey, I don't know where to begin, if you go to thereadystate.com, we have a 14-day on-ramp program. So you get an email a day with some videos about how to begin this conversation of self-maintenance. You can cancel after 14 days, won't be charged. But one of the things that Juliet and I wanted to do with the site was help people learn how to navigate some very simple pain and position-related problems. And that's what we do in the 14 days. We really, just a little bit at a time, we'll get you spun up. And then secondarily, if you're interested in how it looks like as we actually apply these principles, I really think that my Instagram feed and YouTube video at The Ready State are companion pieces to the site. So if you want to see how I integrate this into actual things, so it's not just talking about it and you have to quit your job and stretch for an hour, that's not what it's about. We're realists, and you can see my thinking, in real time. And I pretty much put up a video a day about my crazy brain. So
that's awesome.
Come along for the ride.
Yeah, I've been following you on YouTube and I've been enjoying it myself. So I encourage all of my listeners to go over there and check it all out. Cool, man. I will have everything linked up. Thank you again so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
It is a super pleasure. Thank you so much, everyone.
Awesome.
In Chicago,
Yes.
You got this. You got this.
I love it. Appreciate the Chicago shout out. Thanks, buddy.